do you think that women in our society, Western societies, are portrayed as weaker than they actually are?
Absolutely.
And whose fault is that?
It's the wimpish fourth-wave feminists. I mean, for heaven's sake, us second-wave feminists fought for the right to be strong, powerful women and not to be chaperones and to be seen as taking our place alongside men and not always up on a pedestal and getting special treatment. I mean, it is one of the most depressing aspects of my life, watching women wimp out and demanding special treatment in all sorts of situations and demanding to be treated like victims and protected by men. Get over it, women.
Things happen so fast nowadays that we quickly forget topics that have been on everybody's mind because new crises arise all the time. But it wasn't more than 3.5 years ago that the Me Too disclosures and subsequent movement shook the world, or at least the so-called Western world. Now, the relationship between the sexes is a sensitive matter that creates emotions. Question is, what was the Me Too lesson? Did we get the whole picture? Are we even capable of discussing sexuality the way we discuss social and political matters? Welcome to Mind the Shift. I am Anders Bolling. My guest today is Bettina Arndt, an Australian sex therapist, journalist, writer of best-selling books, influencer, activist, and combative, I don't know how to pronounce that word, debater of feminism and the rights of women and men. And since about the event of Me Too, she has dedicated much of her time focused on the rights of the latter gender, men. Welcome to the show, Bettina.
And it's very nice to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you. I hope I was correct in describing your resume there.
Yeah, well, look, I haven't been a sex therapist for over 40 years. It was part of my ancient history.
Okay, but you started out that way.
I started out that way. I started out as one of Australia's first sex therapists, and that was sex was what made me famous in my youth. And
wonderful.
I became probably the first person to really speak out in Australia about sex and to make a career, particularly out of working in the media, trying to educate Australians about sex. And
which was necessary at that time, perhaps?
Long time ago. But it was, it was very much a time when sex had been a taboo topic. Yeah. And people were very hungry for information. And it was a great start to the career, believe me.
Yeah. So for how many years did you do that?
I did it for about 10 years. Pretty much. Yeah.
Okay.
And then I had enough. There's a limit to how much sex anyone can take.
You mean in practical life or in theory?
Maybe
both. Maybe.
No, but there's certainly a limit to. I was publishing a little sex education magazine through most of that period, an adult sex education magazine, and it was very much a backyard operation. We did it all from a little shed, literally in the back of our house. And yet it had a very loyal, big following of people who were very keen on receiving more information about sex. And we had a big part of the magazine was a letters column answering people's queries. And people had nowhere to go for advice about sex. And we brought together a team of experts. And so we did all that. And it was a terribly exciting thing to be part of that new wave of information that had been previously forbidden and not to people, and people couldn't access. And
there was really so much happening.
I was a 22-year-old. I was a baby. I was out there. I'd actually done research on teaching women to reach orgasm. I did a Master of Clinical Psychology, and based around this research of talking to women about sex, and I was very keen to spread the word. And one of the reasons I got involved with the media was I decided it was terribly tedious to sit with individual women saying, this is your body, this is your clitoris, this is what you should know. And it was much more efficient to go on television and say, this is your clitoris.
Yeah, you would
that's
reach
what
so many more people at the same time, of course.
It was just extraordinary. I mean, it was a wonderful thing. And I got in no end of trouble. I was banned from live television and radio for 2 years
Why?
We had a censorship body essentially making decisions about what was appropriate behavior, and they never said what I said was, they never named what I said that was inappropriate, but clearly, they blushed a little bit too much.
Okay. So it was because it was graphic language or whatever.
No, never, not particularly language, but I would talk. My research actually involved teaching women to masturbate in order to reach orgasm for the first time, and even that sort of topic was the sort of thing you couldn't talk about.
Like what you just said wouldn't have been possible to say in Australian television.
Well, I was saying it, but that's what got me banned for a couple of years.
I mean, today it's no. I mean, you can say that in the news. Yes.
Yeah. Although interestingly, I look back and I think some of the things I talked about then you wouldn't be allowed to talk about in Australia now.
Still not.
And that is, I think we've come through that era of openness into a much more repressive era, particularly, I don't know whether it's true across the world and whether it's true in Sweden, but and I see a lot of that is due to the influence of the feminist movement, which is pretty not terribly keen, particularly on male sexuality. And that's been one of my battles for decades, I suppose, this sort of idea that
we're going to come back to that, of course. Yeah,
we'll come back to that. But so, I mean, I think there are things. I used to I had my own talkback radio program for a couple of years in Sydney, and there were things I talked about then you can never talk about now.
Like such as.
Oh well, I particularly this was it was very funny actually. It was evening. It was 6:00 at night, and people used to tell me whole busloads of cricketers or footballers would sit in the bus on the way home from their match and not want to get out of the bus because they were listening to my radio program.
Oh, really?
That was very funny.
That's cool.
But I would talk about whatever people rang in about, and I would talk about orgasms and ejaculation or whatever people were interested in. Yeah. But you wouldn't be allowed to do that at 6:00 at night now.
Oh, really? Interesting. We have so much to cover today, Bettina. I mean, gender equality, sexuality, as you're talking about a little bit now, feminism and all that. So I was thinking we should maybe start with what is happening right now, or what you are focusing on right now. You quit journalism a few years ago, as far as I understand, to campaign in different ways for unfairly treated men's rights. And you recently launched a campaign called the Mothers of Sons. Is that right?
Yes, I'm involved with it. Yeah.
Yeah, and you also pursue a fight against so-called kangaroo courts set up at universities in Australia to subject men accused of rape to a speedy judicial process. Can you tell us more about this campaign and this fight of yours?
Well, the kangaroo court campaign is about the fact that activists have bullied our universities into getting involved, usurping criminal law, getting involved in the business of making decisions about sexual assault, investigating allegations of sexual assault, of rape, and then punishing people, but usually men, of course, who they deem guilty. And these are anonymous groups of university officials, no qualifications, no supervision. They're making decisions on a much lower standard of proof than is required under criminal law, the balance of probabilities. They don't allow these young men access to lawyers. They deny them all the normal legal rights they would have in a proper criminal justice system. And this has all happened as a result of feminist campaigning. And a few years ago, I started being contacted by young men in that situation and helping them ward off these committees. These committees have no right to be there. They have no proper authority to make the sort of decisions they're making. I had a young man who was doing a PhD contact me, and he had a demand from a committee, and he couldn't even work out which girl had made this accusation about him, and so we got involved in trying to get proper details of this accusation, and I got a criminal lawyer to help him write to the university saying he had no intention of appearing before this committee. What authority did they have to demand this? And that was the first. And I've had a whole string of cases like that, and I now have a group of lawyers helping me with it. And so a couple of years ago, I decided to go out on university campuses because no one knows this is happening. I mean, it's very rarely spoken about in Australia. And I started to speak on university campuses, which was quite an extraordinary experience because, the activists tried terribly hard to stop me. I mean, the first university where I tried this, they said, no, I wasn't allowed to give my speech because it conflicted with the values of the university. And I got the press to put some pressure on them, and then they backed off and they allowed me to speak. But we had all these protesters bashing on the windows and trying to drown me out. And then, even more exciting, I had a talk at Sydney University where they needed the riot squad. The elite police group had to come in and drag and ensure that I could speak by removing these protesters who were blocking entry to the venue. And that was incredibly exciting event, which got enormous. I mean, I was in many ways delighted. They absolutely played into my hands because enormous publicity. The government then instituted an inquiry into free speech on campus because this was this tiny minority group imposing their will about who was allowed to speak on their campus. And most people thought that was pretty outrageous. And it actually led to the government introducing new legislation, new laws to control what free speech on campus. So I see that as a tiny part of my legacy if I achieve nothing else.
But I don't know
that was part of
really,
it.
how did the so-called kangaroo courts come about? Who were pushing for this, and why did it happen in the first place?
Well, I don't know whether you remember, it all started really in America under Joe Biden, funnily enough. Joe Biden, as vice president in the Obama administration, openly said he wanted to use the university campuses to change the sexual culture of America. And he openly stated that. And he was the main driving force behind the Obama administration requiring all publicly funded universities to introduce tribunals to adjudicate sexual assault and sexual harassment as well on campuses. Same sort of thing, no legal protection for the accused. There's been literally hundreds of cases in America where accused students have taken legal action against universities for failure to protect their legal rights, and they're winning consistently. Most of these cases, the families, the accused young men, are winning against the universities, and there's this whole history behind that. And lo and behold, I could see it starting in Australia. It started with this whole campaign, starting with this idea that there's a rape crisis on our campus, and they manufactured statistics. And then
Who are they?
The feminist activists. Absolutely, okay. Feminist activists, openly stating, and it's very interesting. There's documentation showing they believe that our criminal justice system fails rape victims, that they don't get enough convictions, particularly in these cases involving young people. So it's a date rape, it's a boyfriend-girlfriend situation, and the juries, most of our cases end up before juries, and they don't know who to believe when they get he said, she said evidence. And the rape penalties are very high. We've got 7-10-year sentences potentially that these boys are facing, and juries tend not to convict young men in that circumstance when they can't work out what the evidence is actually proving, which is totally reasonable, I would say.
Yes,
but the feminists don't think that's reasonable, and they want more convictions, and they openly state that. The goal of this campus kangaroo courts is to get more rape convictions by lowering the standard of proof. And that's exactly what they did in America, and that's what they're doing here. And I think that's an absolute outrage. And we've had this ongoing battle for the last few years. we won a major legal victory where, in one case, in one state, the judge ruled that the universities had no right to make these sort of decisions, no right to steal. They're stealing young men's degrees. I mean, here's someone who spent maybe hundreds of thousands of dollars on a degree, years of their life, and the university has taken it upon themselves to just steal that from them, to refuse to give them their degrees. It's just extraordinary.
But what happens if they're sentenced by these special tribunals, these kangaroo courts? They have to go to an ordinary court after that, or criminal court?
Yes,
so, I mean, they're not sentenced to prison at the university campuses.
No, they're not sentenced to prison, because the only penalties they've got is to disrupt their education.
Okay, yeah, that's bad enough.
It's a game we're playing, because the universities are claiming they're sending them all to the criminal courts first. But in the meantime, they have to protect the female student. So I had a young man in the middle of the COVID crisis this year, a pharmacy student. He was in his final months of his 4-year degree, and the university refused him to, because when the accusation was made, it was referred to a criminal court, but the university took it upon themselves to ban him from going to campus until that criminal hearing, which has actually not happened yet. It's going to happen in a few months' time. And we had to try to he had a compulsory part of his course. He had to be on campus, some sort of practical work. And they refused to let him on campus. We got the lawyers. We found actually a special provision whereby we found that these investigations are not supposed to disrupt their educational achievement. And so we used that. Anyway, it's this endless maneuvering my campus lawyers are using to try to have, introduce some measure of justice for these young men. Anyway, so that's where we are. But it's made me enemy number one in Australia for a certain, and in particular for one woman, interestingly, who has been, she was one of the main players in this group called End Rape on Campus, and I'm undermining her work, and she's been publishing article after article defaming me and presenting misinformation.
And have you been able to debunk? I mean, to
destroy my reputation. She's been on Twitter calling for people to make complaints, saying I misrepresent my qualifications. I'm not really a psychologist. It's a complicated story. I'm not registered as a psychologist because actually, I only worked as a therapist for about 6 months, and then the rest of my life I worked in the media. So anyway, it's been this ongoing, it's like an ultimate cat fight between this young activist and this old grandma, which is pretty funny.
Yes.
But she took me out last year because I was stupid enough to accept an award from our government, which is called an honours award. And very provocatively, I suppose, we framed it in terms of my work for men and work for achieving gender equity through advocacy for men. And of course, that inflamed the feminists, and they absolutely showed their strength. They recruited 2 attorney general, who are the chief legal officers for 2 states, and the Australian Senate, to demand my award be rescinded. They released all sorts of misinformation. If you go to my wiki page, they captured my wiki page a year ago.
Activists tend to do those things with people they don't like.
All this rubbish. If anyone's interested in this story, on my website I've got the true story. But if you Google my name,
it's the first thing you see when you get to your website. I think it's bettinaarndt.com. You can see that you got your award finally.
I got my award, but I go through who was out to get me and why and the evidence for it. Because if you Google my name, you'll find innumerable articles defaming me, misrepresenting. I've had a 45-year career in the media. I've written hundreds of articles. It's very easy to take a quote from here and a point from there and muddle them all up and misrepresent them, and that's what they've done.
It's a bit scary.
I've made hundreds of YouTube videos. You'll learn this, and if you get, and then they can use a sentence from here and a bit from there and put them all together and make you look appalling. And that's exactly what they've done.
Yes.
And
And
I've
this
dealt all my life with really provocative topics, so it's very easy to do that.
Yes, yes. You're brave. So this Mothers of Sons campaign is based on the same thing, isn't it? It's also about
Mothers of Sons. I mean, I started work. I thought
unfairly accused young men.
Yeah. Well, when I was under attack, when they were trying to cancel me, I thought it'd be better to work with a group of women, and I pulled together some of the mothers I knew who've had sons who've been falsely accused of rape, of domestic violence, and sons who've been through dreadful ordeals in what I regard as a criminal justice system that's now firmly tilted in favor of, believe the victim justice, believe women and not believe men. And we have, 20 mothers who came together initially with incredible stories about what's happened to their sons, really heartbreaking stories. I mean, like a mother whose son was in a battle with a rather violent woman, and eventually our family court ruled that the father should look after this child, have major care of this child. They told the mother, who promptly killed this little girl, toddler, killed this woman's granddaughter. And I mean, that's obviously a very extreme example.
Yeah.
But we've had, so we've got a number of examples like that, but also lots of examples just simply of lots and lots of grandmothers who never see their grandchildren because the ex-spouse, the man's wife, just forbids any contact with the husband, with her former husband, and with the grandparents. And I'm sure in Sweden, across the world, there are grandparents who just never see their grandchildren because of this sort of vindictiveness. And the courts, well, certainly in Australia, the courts are very bad at enforcing orders to require children to see their fathers and to see their paternal grandparents. Our family court is a joke when it comes to enforcing orders to protect men's rights. It's all women can get away with anything. Women can move from one end of the country to the other. What's happened in recent years is false allegations have become the weapon of choice in our family court system. So if you ring up the police and say my partner has physically abused me, the police are required to come and remove that man from the home with no evidence, no investigation, nothing. Men that can leave their home and not see their children for 2 years. I mean, it's the most extraordinary.
Yeah. Well, that's the other side of the story, of course, and because it's very different from what we read about in the media for the most part. I mean, women who are actually being harassed and tormented by their ex-husbands and ex-partners, which is happening, of course, all the time.
Of course, it's happening. And it came from a very important place. We had to protect women from violent men. I mean, it was really important these rules were set up, and we did more because police didn't used to intervene in these domestic cases, and it was extremely important. We started changing the law to ensure that sort of protection, but it's absolutely being misused. I don't know about your situation, but it's certainly the case here in America and Britain, where there's what I would call the domestic violence industry. It's become a huge cash cow for the feminists. That's how they get most of their funding. We've spent $3 billion in Australia on domestic violence funding, which is all about, setting up refuges for women, which is fine if they're genuine refuges, but not a single refuge in the whole of Australia for men who are dealing with violent wives and protecting children from violent mothers. There's nowhere for men to go in Australia. And yet our official statistics show at least a third of the victims of violence are male. We know this. And
yes, it's very interesting. I read what you wrote about that, and that's really truly interesting figures.
Yeah.
You wrote the book Men Too, came out in 2018, was it? 2.5 years ago.
A couple of years ago. It was just really a collection of my writing over the last few decades.
Okay.
It wasn't.
But what was it? Did you decide to write it or to compile it as a reaction to the
compile it? I brought together most of my major pieces I'd written about what's happening to men in this culture are increasingly anti-male culture. And I mean, I started off as a feminist, firmly believing that women were disadvantaged in a whole range of areas in our lives. But I watched that change and I celebrated that change. I mean, women, it was so exciting to see choices opening up for women and women getting protections in key areas, not only sexual assault, but, marital rape and all sorts of areas where we hadn't looked carefully at the business of providing women with safe environments. And that was a wonderful thing. And women flooding into our universities and doing really well. But then, I think we achieved most of the goals I had for women by certainly by the 1980s. And from then on, it's been about advantaging women at the expense of men and very deliberately doing that.
Why do you think that happened? Why do you think that happened why did it go that far in your view?
Oh, I think fourth wave feminists, a lot of them are pretty anti-male. They're keen on getting vengeance, some of them, for what they see as the imbalance in past history, where that women were badly treated historically, and it's our time. I used to write a lot about boys' education. That was one of my pet subjects, probably 20 years ago, and the fact that boys, there came a point where boys were really struggling, and our education system was full of boys dropping out and boys not engaging in education and being disruptive and filling the classes of remedial reading or whatever it was. And lots of parents were noticing this, and fantastic to have girls winning all the prizes, but not when the boys are absolutely filling the bottom end. Some of those boys are not achieving their potential. So I wrote about that, and I got this really wonderful letter, which I must one day get framed, abusing me and saying, my daughter must be ashamed of having such a mother, and it's only our due that women should be absolutely dominating education to make up for all those women who suffered in the past. It was about vengeance. It was most extraordinary.
So we should take responsibility for the thousands of generations behind us.
Absolutely. And of course, that's all really arguable too. If you look up through past history, men and women had very difficult lives.
Of course.
And both men and women. And it was a family unit who suffered together, men and women living very short lives and, losing children, dying very young and suffering ill health, and men working extremely hard, as did women. No one was having a great time, particularly if you got into below the
it's now that we have the time to reflect upon this whole thing. People didn't even have time to think about it.
And the notion of male, even now, of course, the notion of male privilege is such a joke. Not much privilege involved in being a very, very poor white man in any of our country, a white male who's, living in the boarding. Who are the homeless? I'm sure the same applies in Sweden as it does here. The men who are eking out an existence, living in caravan parks and filling the boarding houses and sleeping rough on the streets, they're all men. Hardly, they're
mainly,
now making
not all of them, but mainly, yes.
No, they're making a huge fuss because we're seeing more women, and they say, X 100% more increase in women. That's increased from virtually zero, whereas it's still in Australia, 70% of men are the ones sleeping rough on our streets. All those areas. We have a gender neutral national suicide policy. And yet 6 out of the 8 people who kill themselves every day in Australia are male. And health bureaucrats refuse to do proper research, finding out why men are killing themselves. And we actually know why men are killing themselves. A lot of those men are really at risk because of the consequences of divorce and the hideous business of dealing with a biased family court system, which allows women to remove their children and to make false accusations, and there are no consequences for the women for doing that sort of thing.
The issue of domestic violence that you were touching upon briefly here, is of course a very sensitive matter. You point out, when I read the material that you sent me, you point out that statistics are skewed to the detriment of men here when you look at it. According to Australian statistics, if you look closer at it, you can see that an equal percentage of children experience violence from the mother as from the father. And also very interesting studies show that the woman in a couple is the perpetrator just as often as the man is, and we're talking about pushing, slapping, throwing things and that kind of thing. But men, of course, don't report as often as women do, and men don't get hurt as often as women do. So are we here talking about physical violence all the time, or maybe are we talking about perhaps psychological violence, wording?
If we start
I mean, because just let me finish that. What about injuries that you see, hospital cases, and also the fact that the proportion of killers is predominantly male? I mean, the male proportion of killers is much bigger
than. It is predominantly male. Well, we'll talk about the physical violence first.
Yes.
You mentioned Australian research. There was actually a huge American study, and it involves some experts from Britain as well, but they went through 1,700 peer-reviewed papers, and the overwhelming evidence is that most violence is two-way violence involving women as well as men. And you mentioned, I mean, the issue is, what are you asking? If you ask who is a victim of violence, most men won't say I'm a victim. Men are very reluctant to see themselves as victims. But if you go out and ask who's perpetrated violence, that's where you get large numbers of women acknowledging their perpetrators. There was a famous study in New Zealand. They had a thing called the Christchurch Longitudinal study, which was absolutely world-leading longitudinal research following families through for decades after decade. And they went out to look at this, and instead of asking who's victim of violence, they started asking who starts the violence, who have you ever hit your partner? And they found, much to their astonishment, they found more women than men acknowledging they'd started.
Super interesting.
Yeah. And they of course, were absolutely jumped on those researchers. And I tried to get hold of one of those researchers when I was writing about this just a few years ago.
Yeah.
Asking her about this research she did 20 years ago. And she said she won't talk about it anymore. I mean, people who do proper, honest research in this area have their grants threatened. They have had death threats. I mean, there's an enormous pressure on them.
From whom? From feminists?
From feminist researchers who are promoting this idea that it's all violent men, that there's no real problem with violent women, and that women need all the funding to protect them. Do you know about there's a famous woman called Erin Pizzi, who's a British, fabulous story. Erin Pizzi, who's now in her 80s, I think. She was the first woman to ever set up a refuge for women in 1970 something, early 1970s in Britain. And she set up this refuge, and much to her surprise, she found she had a real problem with violent women who were abusive to other women, hitting other women and hitting their children. And she started to speak out about this. She had death threats from the feminists. They killed her dog, literally. And the police advised her to leave the country. And for a while, she moved out of Britain. And Erin Pizzi is an extraordinarily brave woman, has been speaking out for 40 years about what she calls the 40 years of lies about domestic violence. And she absolutely spells it out, that she watched as the women's movement, initially was met with a huge wave of enthusiasm, and everyone signed up and everyone sent in money, and then things started to wane a little bit. And Erin Pizzi says that there was a very deliberate decision to pick on domestic violence as the cash cow, because it's untouchable. You cannot critique the funding for domestic violence without running into an awful lot of criticism from men and women. I mean, men are notoriously protective of women now, which is a wonderful thing. And they like the idea of supporting, of doing something about men who are violent towards women. Everyone gets on board this cause. And that's been the major source of funding for feminism around the world in the last 2 decades. And that's what Erin Pizzi points out. And she's been extremely unpopular with the feminists ever since.
I can understand that. Fascinating. Well, this thing that if researchers ask the question, who is the perpetrator rather than who is the victim, you get very different kinds of answers than normally. That's really
sorry,
interesting.
And so I just mentioned the homicide thing. Of course, it's true that you've got bigger men, and if once the violence starts, women are more at risk of serious injury or death. And that all the statistics everywhere show that, and there's no questioning that. But if we're looking at family violence, of course, children are more at risk from violence from their mothers. They're more likely to be murdered by their mothers. They're more likely to be emotionally abused by their mothers. And those statistics are invariably buried. And so it's very careful the way this is all framed, so that they leave out truths, that inconvenient truths that they don't want to dilute that narrative. And it's the most amazing thing. There was a friend of mine who's a relationship counselor in one of our big relationship organizations who lost his job through posting my article where I pulled together all the proper statistics and research on domestic violence. He posted that on his private Facebook page, and this government-funded relationship counselling organization fired him or forced him out of his job because they proudly said they promote a feminist domestic violence policy which only focuses on violence against women. They were not interested in violence against men. And they don't want any of their counsellors discussing it. And he'd been saying, look, I see plenty of couples where the man and the woman will say, I struggle with dealing without conflict without hitting him. And I don't want to be like that, you know.
Yeah, well, what you're describing is kind of a cancel culture, I guess, and you can see that in many areas. This is your area of expertise, but you can. Well, I think many people will recognize the kind of happenings here in other fields as well. And what you just said answered the question that I was going to ask about the proportion of the level of violence and why it's probably more serious when the men actually hit than when the woman does it.
Yeah, so but you know, women are very good at throwing things. We've got figures in Australia on men and women turning up in emergency wards, and you have just as many men turning up injured as you do women. But that doesn't come out. Yeah.
No, that never comes. And then maybe it's a bit embarrassing for men, and it's almost stigmatizing to talk about these things. They don't want to describe themselves as victims.
And if they call the police, the police tell them to man up.
Oh yeah,
you know, you're a 6'2" bloke. What are you doing? Well, how can you claim that this little woman is attacking you? I mean, I've talked to so many men in that situation. Often the issue is the children, and men quite rightly are nervous of their physical strength. They don't want to get into a physical fight with their partner, so they'll restrain themselves, even if she's, you know, hitting them over the head with a frying pan or whatever it is. I mean, I've seen photos of men with, you know, nails raked down their faces or attacked with knives or whatever it is. And they just take it and take it and take it. And then sometimes they might retaliate. But they will stay there for the sake of the children. I mean, that's the really interesting position we've reached in our society now, is that whereas once women were stuck in relationships because they had nowhere to go, you know, they couldn't escape a violent man, they couldn't escape a philandering man, you know, they had to put up or shut up. Men are now in that situation because they know if they leave, they'll lose their children. If they call the police, the chances are the police will believe her and they won't see their children for years on end. And they'll lose, well, you know, the jokes about men giving away houses. I mean, it's actually not a joke about divorced men losing a huge proportion of their assets through divorce, and let alone the legal battles that can take enormous amount of their assets just through paying lawyers. I mean, they're on a hiding to nothing if they stand up and say, I'm leaving, I want to still see my children. you're a violent woman. I've done interviews with men in that circumstance, and they will hang in for grim death rather than take that risk. It's tragic. And not only the other classic area, of course, we haven't really got onto sex, but I mean, men will cope with no sex in their marriages for 20 or 30 years rather than risk losing their children. And it's the most extraordinary. And
we'll
that's
talk
the
about
other
sex
area.
soon.
That's
we'll
the other area
sex.
that I've spent a lot of time on.
Finish this topic by asking about something that many debaters say, and they not only feminists. I read just today in the paper here in Stockholm, a famous Danish writer saying the same thing, that one thing that men don't understand is that women are afraid almost all the time. That's something that you hear often, constantly afraid. Maybe it is that women remember instances of violence more clearly because they are afraid, or is it? Do you even believe that?
I don't agree with that at all.
Women are more afraid than men when they're walking in the streets. When they're, regardless of whether it's relevant or not, to be afraid, they might be that. They might think that they're going to be attacked or raped or whatever.
Which, of course, is particularly I would have thought countries like Australia and Sweden, the chances of actually being attacked in the streets, thank goodness, are still pretty low. Yet, I think it's probably true that women are more likely to be nervous in that situation than men are. And yet, of course, men are much more likely to be attacked, much more likely to subject
not raped, though.
No, that's right. But murdered, yes, absolutely. There are violent, usually men, unfortunately, in our society who will attack random strangers on the streets. And I mean, we're seeing increasing numbers of women doing that, young women. Unfortunately, we've seen a real trend in Australia towards gangs of violent women. But women are smaller. Women are, there's a natural fear in women, but I don't believe it's something that rules most women's lives.
Okay.
We just, it means if we're going into an empty car park at night, we will be cautious. Yeah. But there are plenty of situations where men are cautious too. Mm-hmm. I mean, I spent 5 years living in New York, and believe me, this was in the 1980s, men and women rightly took precautions about where they walked at night. Yeah, and it's just nonsense to suggest this never applies to men.
Do you think that women in our society, Western societies, are portrayed as weaker than they actually are?
Absolutely.
And whose fault is that?
It's the wimpish fourth-wave feminists. I mean, for heaven's sake, us second-wave feminists fought for the right to be strong, powerful women, and not to be chaperones, and to be seen as taking our place alongside men, and not always up on a pedestal and getting special treatment. I mean, it is one of the most depressing aspects of my life, watching women wimp out and demanding special treatment in all sorts of situations, and demanding to be treated like victims and protected by men. Get over it, women.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, I just find it really offensive.
Yeah. Interesting. Good answer there. Well, it gives me something to think about.
And that my mother's, I know so many women who feel like this. I mean, I'm this little sounding board, I think, not only for men. I mean, I get thousands of letters from men, but I'm hearing more and more and more from women who just hate, particularly older women like me, who were once proud feminists, who feel the whole movement has been hijacked now, but something we don't recognize at all, and we think is appalling. The way both men and women are being portrayed now does both genders a real disservice.
The whole thing should be about us being equal and having equal opportunities and equal rights. That's the thing, isn't it?
So, and walking in each other's shoes and understanding each other.
Exactly.
Rather than I mean, this is all about creating division between men and women, and fighting for victim status, which is just,
it's a bit appalling to force women to become victims, actually. Anyway, we have to time flies, and we have to talk about sex, of course, which goes together with everything else that we were talking about. But sex can be such a nice thing. It can be combined with terrible things, but it's often a very nice thing. But anyway, I'm very interested in the issue of mismatched desire, as you've been talking about in big talks, and there's a very popular video where you talk about this on YouTube. And you wrote this book, The Sex Diaries, which came out maybe in the 90s or so, if I'm...
I think it's at least 10 years ago,
At least 10 years ago. Okay, so it's in the 2000s. Anyway.
This is one of the best, and let me tell you about this. This was one of the best ideas I've ever had.
Yeah.
Everyone's always curious about how often other people do it. We're always wondering. And we rarely have open conversations, even with our close friends, about the sexual frequency. And I thought,
well, it's sensitive.
It's but I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to get people to keep diaries about negotiating sex in a marriage? On any day, if you feel like having sex, what do you do? Do you ask for it? Do you just hope for the green light? How do you negotiate that? How does she react? Does she reject you? How do you feel? And get both of them to write about that. And I recruited people through the media, and I got 98 couples who kept diaries for up to a year. And I wrote this book called The Sex Diaries, putting together their experiences about negotiating sexual desire in a relationship. And I mean, it was just it was such a funny time of my life, because they'd often write their little diaries, get up at 3 o'clock in the morning to send it in to me, and I'd leap out of bed every day to see what happened last night.
Yeah.
And then you'd get his version, and then you'd get her version. You think, are they talking about the same relationship? It was just wonderful. And I'll send you a copy. I think it's a fantastic book, because it's full of real stories, people's lives, but also at the heart of it is this absolute tragedy of sex-hungry men. I mean, of men more and more. We've got an increasing gap between men and women in terms of sexual desire, and there's been some American researchers tracking that and showing the gap increases. I mean, it's the great jokes about the honeymoon, having more sex in the first year than you do all the, I'm sure you know
the
about
rest
the
of your life,
But I mean, unfortunately, that's very true, and it's more and more by being driven by women's lack of desire. I mean, once, if we go back to the 1950s, there was an assumption of wifely duty, of women looking after their husbands. That was part of the deal of marriage, and that's just gone out the window. And now we have, if women, the feminists, it's been very much part of the feminist campaign to convince women that if they're not interested in sex, it needn't happen. There's no sexual obligation in marriage at all anymore. And
what's your view on that? What do you say?
Absolute tragedy. I mean, if you went out and asked men and women what's missing for their marriages, you'd get the vast majority of marriages, men saying not enough sex or no sex. I mean, I have had men tell me that, they listen to me talking about this on the radio and they'd be listening with tears rolling down their cheeks because they'd never heard anybody talk about that in their whole lives before. No one talks about what it's like for a man to feel like a beggar, to grovel for sex, to feel there's something wrong with them, to ask their wife to make love to them. I mean, the experiences of men in talking about this just wrung me out. And so many women. I was once giving a talk about this to a group of lawyers, and a woman came up to me afterwards and said she was sitting with her husband, and I was talking about all of this, and she said she looked at him and he had tears in his eyes, and he reached for a glass of water and quickly drank it down. She'd never in her whole marriage seen him cry before.
Oh, really?
And it was just this sense of someone talking about his heartache and spending his life being constantly rejected.
It's a grief.
And women talk ad nauseum about their wants and needs, and why aren't men doing this, and why aren't men talking to us more, and why aren't men doing more housework, and this is the number one thing men long for in their long-term relationships, is to feel wanted and desired and to feel like a man. And women are saying, Phooey, if I'm not interested in sex, so you're not going to get any. I mean, for heaven's sake, how is this possible?
Yeah. Well, you have what is very compelling and what resonates with me, since I'm a man and I recognize a lot of what you're writing about here and explaining, is that men have this, you might call it eternal flame, or you could say the constant itch if you want to be more down to earth. While women, as far as I can understand, and I can see it in my life myself, that it might be like this, they can kind of shut down their sexuality completely during periods in their life, and they can turn it on again if they want periodically. But it's like,
if they want,
if they want. But for a man, it's not really possible. And I'm not a biologist, but I guess it has to do with the testosterone, because it's always there in a way, and it's very. I mean, sometimes I wish it weren't, because it would be so much easier.
The monkey on your back. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So is it the testosterone, or is it something else?
I think it is testosterone. I think there's a real biological difference there. Yeah. And I mean, it's complex, the biology. It's a mixture of, now there's of course this huge cultural component telling women that it's fine not to be interested. I mean, this question of what it was like in the 1950s, where we assume women suffered through a lot of unwanted sex. But maybe if you had a different expectation, because one of the things, maybe if you expect to have sex, if you like, and you assume, well, you might as well try to enjoy it, many women would end up enjoying it. This is one of the theories I play with in my book, which got me into enormous trouble.
Oh, the Canoe Theory.
You put the canoe in the water and start paddling, and then desire often kicks in. I mean, there's a professor in Canada who did research on women who had no desire for an awfully long time, and she found that there are many women who have no desire but can still enjoy sex if you put that canoe in and start paddling. So you need that. You need to be with a lover who knows how to please you. Obviously, you're not going to enjoy sex unless you have all the ingredients there. But also, you have to have the willingness to be receptive.
Put some effort in.
You have to know. You know in your head, I may not feel like it now, but I know once I get going, I'll really enjoy it. And
once you've tried that, you might remember afterwards and realize that this is going to work.
Right. If I do, and that's the just do it idea. And many women said to me, they know that. They have to overcome their resistance and think, oh, I'm too tired, I can't be bothered, I'd rather watch television. And think, no, I will. It's not for him. I mean, it's not. There's nothing wrong with having sex for him, but it's also for her to say, I enjoy sexual pleasure. I enjoy the intimacy. I enjoy all the good stuff that comes from making love to the man you love. I mean, why wouldn't I want that? And every time I have it, I think, why don't we do this more often? But women could go for years having no sexual desire. It's very common.
And when it awakens again, they're surprised that they had it.
I know.
Oftentimes,
Oh, look, the whole area is so complex and individual. But we're now imposing, I think, cultural changes on people's expectations around desire, which are really destructive to relationships. And that's what really bothers me.
Well, the right to say no, for women to say no, was, of course, extremely important when it was put forward in the 60s
Absolutely.
or 70s, as you point out. But maybe would you say that the right to say no has been interpreted too literally, in a sense?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, of course, women have a right to say no, but I think they have to realize there are very good reasons for saying yes, other than that initial desire, because of the fact that, as I say, many women might find they enjoy it once they get going. Plus, it's really good for the relationship. It's really bad for the relationship to go for years with no sex. I mean, men don't want to live with a sister or a roommate. If you get married or if you're in a long-term relationship, you want a lover. And they're living with extremely unhappy men if they impose that regime on a man. And and it introduces all sorts of poison in the relationship. And I think it's a real tragedy that we're not even allowed to talk about this very often. If you Google me, you'll find all these articles sneering at me for telling men, there's a blogs talking about me as a rape cheerleader, and that's the idea that I'm saying, men, go home and rape your wives. And of course, obviously, I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that women have to think about why they might want to say yes a little bit more often. Of course, they have a right to say no, but I don't think that's in their interest either. To say no all the time.
Yeah, well, it's easy to say to drive the idea of the right to say no than the duty or the obligation in a loving relationship to sometimes maybe say yes. That's a little bit more difficult.
I also don't think it. See, there is this idea now in our culture that sex is something so precious and different from any other aspect of life. So, you cook meatballs for him and you don't like meatballs, but they're his favorite dish, so you do it for him. I mean, we do lots of things. Men don't want to climb up on roofs and get leaves out of the gutter or go out and sweep the snow from lots of stuff we do for each other isn't much fun. This happens to be something which can be enormous fun if you get into it. But it's not, I think lots of women don't see it as divorced from all the other aspects of life where we do negotiate. And they're the women who are sexually generous and know how to look after their husbands or their partners, but they are becoming rather thin on the ground, sadly.
When all these Me Too stories came out, I was, and many men among me were upset, of course. But in most of the cases, and this is where it gets a bit difficult to talk about actually, but I would do it anyway. In most of the cases, there seemed to be a core element of sexual drive in the groping and whatever these men did that was actually explicable to me and many other men. And it's very difficult to talk about this with women in particular. Decent men condemned the acts, of course. But while we did this, if I consider myself as a decent man, which I do, but we did this mostly from a moral perspective, if you see what I mean. Meaning that those Me Too men, they should have, of course, had full respect for the other human being and stayed away from all forms of sexuality in that situation, in that instance. But many women condemned acts that they didn't understand at all. They were completely incomprehensible to them. And to be able to understand anything of it, many of these women decided that it must have to do with power, It's all about power, they say. And many decent men, they don't say anything to that because perhaps they convince themselves to believe the power theory themselves, or they don't want to. They can sense that it would be very difficult for them to explain to women what they actually think about this whole situation. Do you see this dilemma in the same way?
I think the whole thing is much more complex than people are pretending. Even the Harvey Weinstein case, lots of people seem to have known he was a groper, he was going to try it on with you. Some women made the choice that they wanted them apart in a movie. It was worth going in there with that man. They didn't have to do that. The casting couch is a two-way street where, you could argue that this is an appalling thing for men to use their power to gain sexual favors.
Well, it is, of course.
Of course it is. But It's also, there were some women who made the choice not to go near that man because they didn't want that particular bargain, and others who did, and others who accepted large amounts of money they did it, and then he paid them off. There are aspects of the female participation in this equation that are also really dubious. I agree with you. Sometimes men, as part of this sort of lusty sexuality, they're sort of masturbating in front of girls, or pulling their penis, whatever it is. Some of that is pretty gross sort of stuff. Yeah. But a hell of a lot of women have had that sort of experience and said, put it away. No, I'm not interested. That sort of experience has been part of women's lives always, that men will try things on, that some men will behave in a particularly obnoxious way, just as some women behave in a pretty obnoxious way in other areas. And once it was assumed that most women would be able to handle that.
Mm.
I mean, what really got me about Me Too was this earlier thing we were talking about, the fragility of women. There was a Canadian member of Parliament who said she was traumatized for 6 months after she was photographed with two other MPs, both male, and she was in the middle, and one of the men joked, "This isn't the sort of threesome I had in mind."
Oh,
and here's a member of Parliament. I mean, an adult woman who puts herself forward as a leader of people, claiming she's so fragile that I mean, what is wrong with people? You know, there are all sorts of aspects of Me Too that really bothered me right from the beginning. I mean, I acknowledge that there have always been men who've misused their power, no question, and it's important to put a stop to that. But I believe, I mean, in a place like Australia, we've had sexual harassment legislation in place for decades and decades. Me Too wasn't some new revelation. That's always been out there. We've been battling to deal with the serious issues like this. The young woman working in a sandwich shop with a male who's molesting her. All of those sort of situations of power have to be addressed, no question. But we had, as to most other countries, a wave of accusations against prominent men. Almost all the cases have failed. We've had very well-known actors accused of groping women in the middle of a stage play, when he's lifting her in her arms, and case after case have fallen down. There's not been evidence. The woman's evidence has been found to have huge holes in it, whatever. So Me Too has been a
feminists take
failure.
that as an evidence that the society is patriarchal, that these cases are shut.
Not winning. Well, it could also be an argument about that a lot of women have jumped on this bandwagon and they want their 15 minutes of fame, and the big risk in all of this is there's a punitive element. Any man, we've seen some clear cases of this. I don't know whether you're following some of the feminists, the men's rights activists in Canada. Janice Fiamengo is one of them. And Diane Davison, they're working with helping men who are being wrongly accused in Canada, and there's been some big cases in Canada of similar to Australia, where the woman has been proved to have manufactured accusations, and often it's because the man has done something to annoy them. If you have a boss who turned you down for a promotion, or who didn't think your work was up to scratch, or whatever it is, any man a powerful man is now vulnerable to false allegations. And we have seen a wave of that in Australia recently. Historic cases emerging, which are dubious in various ways, and yet absolutely destroying the man's reputation. And I'd be very nervous if I was a man who'd employed lots of women for over the last few decades, because anything could be misconstrued, any allegation can be used to absolutely.
I know many of my friends are talking about that. Actually, I mean, they're not truly afraid that something's going to happen, but it comes up sometimes when I talk freely with close friends that, we might not do that or say that to these women, or we're acting that way, because I mean, who knows what's going to happen, the kinds of accusations you might. But I think the problem is not really big if you're just an honest and decent and loving person who meets people with respect. And
my mothers and sons will say nothing. They all assume nothing could ever have happened to their son because they were good men, decent men. They behaved well. Any man could be falsely accused. Believe me. I hope people will go and have a look at that website. It's mothersandsons.info. And read the stories of these mothers, of what happened to those men. you could have an allegation that has absolutely no foundation, particularly in the context of a family law battle, and she will almost always be believed, and he will be disbelieved. We were about to do a video with a woman whose son is in prison as a result of false allegations made by the children. And part of the evidence in that case was one of the children saying, Mummy told us to say that. All sorts of aspects of the case didn't stack up. There were things that... So one judge decided there was nothing in it, and the man was let out of prison, and then there were new accusations made, and he went back into prison again. I mean, it's a lottery, our justice system now.
So we have to walk on eggshells.
Men, listening to this, don't believe you will be safe by behaving well. That is not true. And I'm just absolutely ashamed of women, the behavior of women. I think there are a lot of women.
Some women, you have to add.
No, I mean, of course, not all women. I have.
I mean, you're that way yourself.
Working women, but I've been just absolutely appalled at how many false allegations are being made, and how commonplace it's become.
But maybe it's a self-fulfilling prophecy in a way, self-playing piano, as we say in Swedish. It started in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and now it's just difficult to stop this whole process. And maybe these women that you're appalled by their acts and their actions, they believe that what they're doing is the right thing. I assume.
It's interesting. I'm going back to my college students, my university students who've been accused. I mean, there's been a number of cases where the woman initially has said nothing happened, where they've been caught. There's one case in particular where they were caught in a compromising situation where she'd been very drunk. He had helped with a group of students put this girl to bed, and then he was still in this accommodation when she sort of came to and woke up and started. He says started to seduce him. They were, undressing him, and then everyone came back in, and the girl said nothing happened until one of her friends who influenced her. So she changed her story a number of times, from saying there was no problem, no sexual assault, nothing, to eventually saying he sexually assaulted her. I mean, in this sort of situation, we now have people who have ideological agendas, and you can have perfectly innocent girls who don't see anything wrong as having happened, who end up getting caught up in the business of being a victim and making an accusation against the man. It's just shocking.
Is it fair to say that you have made a journey from being a vocal feminist to being a vocal masculist?
Oh, absolutely. No
Is that
question
a term
about that.
that you can use?
No, I usually say, I don't even talk about men's rights. I talk about men's issues that interest me, because it's not necessarily about rights. It's about, because it's also about children's rights. I mean, how I really got involved in men's rights was through advocating on behalf of children who weren't seeing their fathers. That was the major shift for me, realizing the appalling statistics on how few children have a decent relationship with their fathers after divorce. It's a real tragedy. And, the research on the impact of children are missing out on that, care by fathers is really solid. Most children benefit from having a father in their lives, and we are doing them a huge disservice in allowing so many single children to grow up in single mother families, and dads being pushed out of that family. That's what led to it.
How do you define feminism? Do you call yourself a feminist these days?
Not anymore. I remember, I made a decision at some point. Enough. Feminism is no longer what I believe in.
The connotations are too far away from what you believe. But I mean, you can. I guess you can define. Yeah, you can define feminism that way.
Feminism is not about equality now.
Isn't it? Okay. Well,
No, it's become really...
I call myself a feminist, but my definition is not radical. It's more like, we should all have equal rights and equal opportunities, and there has been a unfairness towards women in history in our society, and we have to get rid of that. But other than that, we should have all the same opportunities and the same rights, and that makes me want to call myself a feminist. But maybe your connotation is a bit different.
Yeah, but I object to the constant distortion of research, of statistics, of the whole cultural dialogue to present the image of women as constantly disadvantaged and men as always privileged. I've just written an article this week about our taxation system, because one of our, I would call them left-leaning woke institutions, has just published a study claiming that men get all the benefits from the tax concessions, and women don't, and that men come out twice as well as women do. And if you look, I then happened to I was digging around on our official taxation office's website, and I found this wonderful graph which showed that we have do you have superannuation in Sweden? What we call, it's like compulsory savings. The government takes some of our money as throughout our working lives, which they save for our old age. That's called superannuation.
It's like the retirement system, or
like a retirement benefit system, and that women end up with much smaller levels of superannuation than the men do, because they work. In Australia, we have had a very traditional society where most women still want to look after their own children when they're young, and they tend to work part-time, particularly in those early years. And then they actually don't, a quarter of women retire again by 45. So they're working very short periods of their lives. Even if they go back into the full-time workforce after having children, they pull out again pretty quickly. And men tend to work all their lives in full-time work. It's pretty unusual for men to work part-time for long periods. And they earn much more money over their lifetime as a result, and they end up with more of these retirement savings. And this was presented as, men ripping women off. And it was such a nonsense, because it's so divisive to present an issue like that in those terms. Most marriages are about, or most relationships are about, men and women contributing in their own ways to running this family, and women in our country often choosing to work part-time for long periods, men having to therefore often be stuck in jobs they don't like, sometimes for decade after decade, in order to support their families. But it's about mutual benefit and pulling
but
together.
Shouldn't the fact that the women take care of children, which is such an important task, shouldn't be economically castigated? I mean, it should be.
No, but the point is, this statistically, this graph I found showed that women end up with the same money as men do, and no one had ever talked about that in Australia. Okay. And the reason they do is they are the named beneficiaries of this retirement benefit. So the men, when they die, they leave the money to the women, and the women get that money. Or else they divorce, and that is part of the pool of money that's divided between men and women. So women come up, particularly high income, women married to high income earning men get a big hunk of that, what we call superannuation as well. So they do get, this is not his money versus her money. This is our mutual money for our mutual benefit. Women in Australia are, there's plenty of research showing that they make most of the decisions about spending the money. This is not his money. It's being spent on the family, and she's actually doing most of the decision making. So to say, it's not fair that she has this little tiny pool of money in this marriage is just a nonsense argument. And it's divisive, and it's, implying that women are badly done by. When in fact, women end up with just as much money as men do, and no one talks about that.
Fascinating. I think we are going to wrap this up in a little while here. I know that you've done some very interesting interviews with Jordan B Peterson also.
Yeah.
Watched at least one of them. I think it's several, is it? You have
I really only did one. We divided that up into two bits.
Okay, yeah, I saw.
But one long interview. He was out in Australia now, early in his fame, his rise to fame, and I was MC for two of his events, which was just amazing. This huge audience of mainly men, flocking to see their hero.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was an extraordinary experience. And
I was thinking that maybe, you were famous before he was, so maybe you could say that Jordan B Peterson is a male version of Bettina Arndt.
Oh no! Well, I think he got a real shock because most people are very deferential to him and ask him lots of questions and then sit back for the answers. And I was having more of a conversation with him because we were talking about a lot of things I've been working with for years and I know a lot about. So, and I actually got him to talk. He made a very strong statement in that interview with me about there being an obligation to have sex in a marriage. So I pushed him on issues he hadn't been pushed on before, which was quite fun.
Yeah, he's an interesting person. I don't always agree with what he says, but he's very intelligent and to the point. But compared to you, he's a bit more, I don't know, he's a bit gloomy and a bit not, doesn't seem very happy, and he's not oozing love out in his life.
No. And
it's very technical and very academical.
He struggled with depression. He is
I know, yeah.
He's always said that. Whereas the trouble with me is I'm an eternal optimist.
Yeah, but that's wonderful.
I know. Well, and it was fun when I was out there preaching, telling everybody to go and enjoy sex. It's much harder now. I find it very depressing that I have to go out and talk about these really grim topics of what's happening to men, when I'd much rather be entertaining people with jokes about sex. But this has become much more important to me.
Yeah, but you will make a difference, hopefully, and that can perhaps make you happy to think about that.
Oh no, I'm happy. I'm happy anyway. I can't help being happy. So that's a good way to be.
That's wonderful. I love it. So Tina Arndt or Bettina Arndt, I know you're called Tina among your friends. So where can people find your work? You mentioned this website, Mothers of Sons.
Yes, but also probably first at my own website. Just look up Bettina Arndt. And that's a good German name, Arndt, A-R-N-D-T.
Bettina, A-R-N-D-T.com, is it?
And it's BettinaArndt.com. But there's only one Bettina Arndt in Australia, that's for sure. They wouldn't want another one. And then mothersofsons.info is the website of the mothers I'm working
.info.
with.
Okay, yeah. Excellent.
And that's, so I'm devoting a lot of time to that new project now. We had hoped that getting mothers to go out there and talk about this issue would attract media attention. These are women. You're supposed to believe women. But the mainstream media is just not interested because they're talking about men.
From other fields. Yeah, there's always an agenda, or there are blinkers, So anyway, thanks so much.
It's been lovely talking to you. Yeah,
for joining the show, and it's been incredibly interesting and wonderful. So good luck out there on the gender barricades.
Thank you so much.